The coffee shop was almost empty when the man in the gray overcoat sat down at the table next to mine and said very gently, "I'm so sorry for your loss." I looked up from my book. I did not recognize him. He was in his early 50s, with a neatly trimmed beard going to silver at the edges, and the careful, slightly nervous expression of a person who has rehearsed what he wants to say, and is now realizing, in the moment of saying it, that the rehearsal has not prepared him for the reality. I smiled the small polite smile you give to strangers who have mistaken you for someone else. I said, "I think you might have me confused with another person." He frowned. He looked at me more closely. He said, "You're Naomi Whitcomb, aren't you? Daniel's wife." The world stopped moving. I want you to understand what that sentence did to me, because the rest of this story does not make sense unless you understand the moment it began. My name is Naomi Whitcomb. My husband's name is Daniel Whitcomb. He is 43 years old. He works as a senior project manager at a logistics company called Harrogate Industries. He has worked there for 11 years. He had left for work that morning at 6:45, the way he had left for work every morning for the past 6 months, and he had kissed me on the forehead and told me he had a long day ahead of him, and that he probably would not be home before 9 that evening. He had texted me at lunchtime, the way he texted me every day at lunchtime, to say he loved me. The most recent text was still on my phone. I could see it if I looked. The man across from me was looking at me with the expression of a person who has just realized, with rising horror, that he has said something he was not supposed to say. I said, "Yes, I'm Naomi. I'm Daniel's wife. I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" He swallowed. He looked at the door. He looked back at me. He said, "I work with Daniel." I worked with Daniel. I'm Marcus Pell. I sat across from him for 9 years. Welcome back to the channel, where the truth always finds its way out, no matter how carefully someone tries to bury it. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story that makes you look at the person sleeping next to you and wonder how well you actually know them. The story I am going to tell you happened over a span of 6 months, but the truth of it stretched back almost 2 years before I knew anything was wrong. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is the only place this story makes sense. I met Daniel when I was 31 years old. He was 33, a quiet, steady man with kind eyes, and the particular reliability of a person who had been raised by parents who taught him that showing up was the most important thing a person could do. He showed up. That was what I loved about him. He showed up to our first date 15 minutes early. He showed up to my apartment with soup when I had the flu in our second month of dating. He showed up to my mother's funeral 3 years later, before I had even asked him to come, because he had heard the news and he knew, without being told, that I would need someone to drive me to the airport. We were married 2 years after we met, in a small ceremony at a botanical garden, with 28 guests and a cake that my best friend baked herself. We bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood. We adopted a cat named Pemberley who slept on Daniel's chest every night for the first 3 years of our marriage. We tried for children and were unable to have them, and we grieved that together. And we built, in the absence of children, a life that was full of small rituals and quiet kindnesses, and the particular comfortable rhythm of two people who had decided, with their eyes open, that they were going to grow old together. For 10 years, Daniel went to work at Harrogate Industries, and he came home and we ate dinner together, and we watched television, and we slept in the same bed, and I believed, with the absolute certainty of a woman who has no reason not to believe, that I knew the man I had married. The change began in the spring. I want to be precise about the timing, because the timing matters. It was the 3rd week of April. Daniel came home one evening and told me, over dinner, that he had been promoted. He was now the senior project manager for a new division at Harrogate, a division that handled international logistics, which meant his hours would be longer and his responsibilities would be greater, but his salary would also be increasing significantly. I congratulated him. I asked him questions about the new role. He answered them with the slightly distracted enthusiasm of a man who was already mentally inside the new job. The next morning, he left for work an hour earlier than usual. That evening, he came home 2 hours later than usual. The pattern continued the next day. And the next. By the end of the 2nd week, his hours had shifted permanently. He left at 6:45 every morning. He came home at 9, sometimes 10, sometimes later. On weekends, he would often spend Saturday at the office, catching up, he said, on the work that had piled up during the week. I noticed. Of course I noticed, but I did not question it because he had told me about the promotion, and the promotion was a reasonable explanation for the shift in his hours, and Daniel was the kind of man who would not, I believed, lie to me about something so easily verifiable. The salary increase appeared in our joint account on schedule. The deposit was substantial. I saw it. I logged into the bank, and I saw the new amount, and I saw the small additional bonus that Daniel had told me would arrive with the promotion. And I had no reason, looking at the numbers, to believe that anything was wrong. The text continued. The lunchtime check-ins, the small affectionate messages, the reminders to pick up milk on the way home, the photos of strange dogs he saw on his walks during his lunch break. Everything that had been part of our marriage for a decade continued, exactly as it had always been, with the only difference being that he was now physically present in our house for fewer hours each day. I missed him. I will admit that. I missed him in the small ways a wife misses a husband when his absence becomes the new normal. When you stop expecting him at the dinner table, when you stop turning over to find him in the bed at midnight because you know, by then, he is still at the office. But I did not suspect him. I want you to understand that. I did not suspect him because there was nothing to suspect. The promotion was real. The salary was real. The texts were real. The man who came home at 9 every night, who kissed me on the forehead and told me about his day in the same quiet voice he had used for 10 years, was real. And so when Marcus Pell sat down across from me in that coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, 6 months and 3 days after the promotion that had changed our lives, and told me that he was so sorry for my loss, I did the only thing a sane woman could do. I told him there had been a mistake. Marcus did not respond right away. He looked at me with the careful expression of a man who has just walked into a situation he does not understand, and is trying very quickly to figure out how to walk back out of it without making things worse. He glanced at the door again. He glanced at his coffee, which he had not yet touched. Then he looked at me and he said very slowly, "Naomi, when was the last time you spoke to Daniel?" I picked up my phone. I unlocked it. I opened the message thread. I turned the phone toward Marcus. The most recent message, sent at 12:14 that afternoon, said, "Long day ahead, baby. Thinking of you. Don't wait up." Marcus read the message. He read it again. The color drained from his face in the slow, gradual way that color drains from a face when a person is realizing something they do not want to be realizing. He set his coffee cup down. He did not look at me. He looked at the table. He said, "Naomi, Daniel died on the 18th of June. We had a memorial for him at the office on the 22nd. His funeral was the following Saturday. I was a pallbearer. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, but I am not sure I have the language for it. The closest I can come is to say that I felt the floor of my life drop away, and I was suddenly standing on nothing, and the only thing keeping me upright was the table between me and a man I had met 4 minutes earlier. I said, that isn't possible." Marcus said, "I went to the service. I helped carry the casket. I shook hands with his sister. His sister flew in from Portland. She gave the eulogy. Daniel did not have a sister in Portland. Daniel did not have a sister at all. Daniel was an only child. His mother had died when he was 19. His father had died when he was 26. He had no siblings. He had 2 cousins on his father's side that he saw at Christmas every other year, and that was the entire extent of his living family. And I knew this because I had been the one, at our wedding, who had organized the seating chart and had had to call Daniel 3 separate times to confirm that, yes, the table for his family really did only need to seat 4 people. I said, "Marcus, Daniel has no sister. He has no family in Portland. He has no family anywhere except 2 cousins in Ohio." Marcus stared at me. The look on his face was the look of a man who is trying to reconcile 2 pieces of information that cannot both be true, and who is beginning to understand, with a kind of slow horror, that one of them is going to have to be a lie, and that the lie is going to be much worse than he had initially thought. He said, "Naomi, there was a woman at the funeral who introduced herself as his sister. There was a man who introduced himself as his brother-in-law. There were photographs. There was an obituary in the local paper. The company sent flowers. I gave a speech, Naomi. I stood up in front of 40 people, and I gave a speech about my friend Daniel. The picture they had at the front of the room was the same picture he had on his desk at work, the one of him on a fishing trip in his blue baseball cap. Daniel did own a blue baseball cap. He had worn it on a fishing trip we had taken together to a lake in Wisconsin, 3 summers earlier. The photograph Marcus was describing was a photograph I had taken. It was framed on Daniel's desk at the office. I had been to his office. I had seen the frame. I knew exactly which photograph Marcus was talking about. My hands began to shake. I put the phone face down on the table because I could not look at the lunchtime text again. I said, "Marcus, please. I need you to tell me everything you remember. Everything. From the beginning." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He took a long swallow. He set the cup down. And he began to talk. Daniel had not come to work on the morning of June 18th. This was unusual. Daniel had been, by Marcus's account, the most reliable person in the office. The kind of employee who arrived early and stayed late, and never missed a day without giving advance notice. By mid-morning, Marcus had tried to call him and had received no answer. By lunchtime, the office manager had called Daniel's emergency contact, the contact listed in his personnel file. The emergency contact was not me. The emergency contact was a woman named Helena Whitcomb, who identified herself in the phone call as Daniel's sister. She lived in Portland. She had been the contact in his file for 6 years. She told the office manager very calmly that Daniel had suffered a sudden cardiac event the previous evening, that he had been rushed to a hospital, that he had not survived. She would be flying in to handle the arrangements. She would be the family's point of contact for any communication going forward. The office was devastated. Daniel had been beloved. The CEO of the company had personally called Helena to offer condolences. The funeral had been held the following Saturday at a small church on the outskirts of the city, a church I had never heard of, in a part of town I had never been to. Helena had stood at the door of the church in a black dress, shaking hands with Daniel's co-workers as they arrived. There had been a closed casket. There had been a slideshow of photographs from Daniel's life, photographs that Marcus had assumed were family photographs, photographs of a younger Daniel with people Marcus did not recognize. There had been a man at Helena's side, a man she introduced as her husband, Daniel's brother-in-law, whose name Marcus could not now remember. There had been a reception at a small banquet hall after the service, where finger sandwiches had been served, and where people had told stories about Daniel, and where Helena had received condolences with the dignified, exhausted grace of a woman who had just lost her only brother. The company had sent a substantial floral arrangement to the funeral. The company had also, Marcus mentioned, made a charitable donation in Daniel's name to a foundation that Helena had specified, a foundation for cardiac research. The check had been for $10,000. It had been mailed to a post office box that Helena had provided. I sat in that coffee shop, and I listened to Marcus describe the funeral of a man who was, at that very moment, sitting in an office somewhere in the city, sending me text messages about how long his day was going to be. Except, of course, he was not. Because there was no office. There had not been an office for 4 months. The man who had been kissing my forehead every morning at 6:45, who had been coming home every night at 9, who had been sending me lunchtime texts about his day, was not going to work. He had not been going to work since the 18th of June. He had been going somewhere else. And the salary that had been arriving in our joint account, the salary I had been logging into the bank to confirm, the salary that had been paying our mortgage and our utilities and our groceries for the past 4 months, had not been coming from Harrogate Industries. It had been coming from somewhere else, too. Marcus finished his coffee. He sat across from me, watching me try to absorb what he had just told me, and he said, very quietly, "Naomi, I think you need to call the police." I did not call the police. Not right away. I want to tell you why, because the why matters. I did not call the police, because I did not yet know what I was reporting. A husband who was alive but had been declared dead at his job? A wife I had never heard of, named Helena, who had organized a funeral and accepted condolences from 40 of his co-workers. A salary that was being deposited into our account by an unknown source? I had nothing to give the police except a story that, told out loud, would sound like the kind of story a woman tells when she has lost her grip on reality. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I asked Marcus for his phone number. I told him I would call him later. I paid for my coffee. I walked out of the coffee shop into the cold October afternoon. I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost an hour, and then very slowly, very carefully, I drove home, and I began to look. The house was exactly as I had left it that morning. The breakfast dishes were still in the sink. Pemberley was asleep on the back of the couch in the same patch of afternoon sunlight she had claimed 3 years earlier, and never relinquished. Daniel's reading glasses were on the end table next to his chair, folded the way he always folded them, with the left arm tucked behind the right. Everything in the house said that a man named Daniel Whitcomb lived here, that he was simply at work, that he would be home at 9, that the life I had been living for a decade was the life I was still living. I stood in the doorway of my own house, and I did not recognize it. I took off my coat. I hung it in the hall closet. I walked through every room of the house with the slow, deliberate steps of a person walking through a museum. I was looking for something. I did not yet know what. I went to the bedroom first. Daniel's side of the closet was full of his clothes, the shirts he wore to work, the suits he wore to weddings and funerals, the small collection of sweaters his mother had knitted for him before she died. His shoes were lined up neatly on the floor. His dresser drawers contained the same socks and undershirts and folded handkerchiefs they had contained for 10 years. I opened the drawer where he kept his watch and his wedding ring at night. The watch was not there. He had been wearing it that morning. The ring was not there either. He had been wearing that too. I went to his nightstand. The drawer contained what it had always contained. A book he had been reading for almost a year, the kind of book a person buys with good intentions and then never quite finishes. A small bottle of allergy medication, a flashlight, a charger for a phone he had upgraded out of 2 years ago. There was nothing in the drawer that did not belong. I went to the small office at the back of the house, the room Daniel used when he had to bring work home, the room I almost never entered because it was his space, and I respected it. The room was tidy. The desk was clear except for a small stack of mail that he had not yet opened. The drawers of the desk contained pens, paper clips, a stapler, the small ordinary debris of an office. I opened the filing cabinet in the corner. The files were organized exactly as Daniel had always organized them, alphabetically, by category. Mortgage, insurance, tax returns, medical, vehicle. I pulled out the folder marked insurance. Inside were the policies for our house, our cars, our health insurance through his employer. I looked at the health insurance policy. The card in my wallet had been issued by Harrogate Industries. I had used it 3 weeks earlier at a routine doctor's appointment, and the claim had gone through without incident. If Daniel had been declared dead in June, the insurance policy would have been canceled. The claim would not have gone through. Either Marcus was wrong, or someone had been keeping the policy active in a way that defied the official record. I went back to the kitchen. I sat down at the table. I opened my laptop. I logged into our joint bank account. I scrolled through the past 6 months of transactions. There it was, every 2 weeks, the direct deposit from Harrogate Industries payroll in the same amount, on the same schedule it had always been on. The most recent deposit had been 2 days earlier. I clicked on the deposit to see the routing information. The account number was the same one that had been depositing Daniel's salary for 11 years. The originator of the deposit was listed as Harrogate Industries. There was no flag. There was no anomaly. As far as our bank was concerned, my husband was being paid by his employer the way he had always been paid by his employer. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the screen, and I felt very quietly the first cold edge of understanding begin to settle in my chest. This was not a clerical error. This was not a misunderstanding at the office. This was something that someone had constructed, very carefully, over a long period of time, and that someone had been maintaining every day for the past 4 months. I picked up my phone. I called Harrogate Industries. The receptionist answered on the second ring. She was the same receptionist I had spoken to several times over the years, a kind woman named Frances who had always made small talk with me when I called. I said, "Frances, it's Naomi Whitcomb. I'm trying to reach Daniel. Is he at his desk?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Frances said, in the careful, gentle voice of a person who had been trained, in some seminar somewhere, to handle exactly this kind of phone call, "Mrs. Whitcomb, I'm so sorry. Daniel passed away in June. Is there someone I can connect you with? A grief counselor. We have resources we can offer." I hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Pemberley jumped up onto the table, the way she had always been told not to, and she rubbed her face against my hand, and I did not push her away. I picked up the phone again. I called the number Marcus had given me. He answered on the first ring. I said, Marcus, I need you to do something for me. I need you to find out who has been receiving Daniel's salary for the past 4 months. The deposits are still coming into our account. They are still coming from Harrogate Industries. The receptionist just told me Daniel is dead. I do not understand how the company can be paying a dead man, and I do not understand how they can be paying him into the joint account I share with the dead man's wife. And I think someone in your office is going to need to explain this to me. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Naomi, I am going to make some calls. I am going to call you back within the hour. Please do not do anything until I call you back. I hung up. I waited. While I waited, I went back to the office. I opened the filing cabinet again. I started pulling files. I was looking for anything that might be evidence of the parallel life Daniel had been living. The life that included a sister named Helena, and a funeral, and a foundation for cardiac research. I found nothing. The files were exactly what they appeared to be. The careful records of an ordinary marriage, the small paper trail of a man who had paid his bills on time, and filed his taxes correctly, and kept the kind of orderly archives that a person keeps when they have nothing to hide. I went into the bedroom. I opened Daniel's nightstand again. I took out the book. I flipped through the pages. Nothing. I shook the book by its spine. Nothing fell out. I opened the drawer underneath the nightstand, the deep drawer where he kept extra blankets in the winter. I pulled the blankets out. I felt around the bottom of the drawer. The drawer was empty. I started to put the blankets back, and as I did, my fingers brushed against something at the very back of the drawer, taped to the underside of the wooden frame. Something flat. Something the size of an envelope. My heart began to beat very fast. I reached back into the drawer. I peeled the tape away. I pulled out a small envelope. It was not sealed. The flap was simply tucked in. I opened it. Inside was a single key, a small brass key, the kind of key that opens a safe deposit box. There was no tag. There was no marking. There was nothing to indicate where the key belonged or what it opened. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I held the key in my hand. The phone rang. It was Marcus. I answered. He said, Naomi, I just spoke with payroll. The deposits to your account stopped on June 19th. There has been no salary deposited from Harrogate Industries to your account in 4 months. Whatever is being deposited into your bank, it is not coming from us. I looked at the key in my hand. I looked at the open drawer. I looked at the empty house around me. And I understood finally that the man I had been married to for 11 years had been preparing, for a very long time, for the day that I would find out. I told Marcus I would call him back. I hung up the phone. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, holding the brass key in my hand, watching the afternoon light move across the floor of the bedroom I had shared with my husband for 11 years. Pemberley wandered in. She jumped up on the bed beside me. She pressed her small, warm body against my hip, the way she had done 1,000 times before. And I put my hand on her back, and I felt the steady rise and fall of her breathing. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, that I was going to have to become a different woman over the next several hours, and that the woman I was about to become was going to have to be smarter and colder and more patient than I had ever been in my life. I stood up. I put the key in my pocket. I went back to the kitchen. I sat at the table. I opened my laptop again. I did not log into the bank this time. I opened a new browser window. I began to search. I searched for Helena Whitcomb. I searched for an obituary for Daniel Whitcomb in our city's newspapers, dated June of that year. I searched for the foundation Marcus had mentioned, the one that had received the $10,000 donation from the company. The obituary existed. It was in a small online edition of a weekly paper I had never heard of, dated June 21st. It described Daniel as a beloved brother, a kind soul, a devoted employee. It listed his survivors as his sister Helena Whitcomb of Portland, Oregon, and her husband, whose name was given as Roland Becker. It said that a memorial service would be held the following Saturday at the Stillwater Chapel, with a private interment to follow. It said that, in lieu of flowers, donations could be made to the Cardiopulmonary Research Trust, with an address that turned out, when I looked it up, to be a post office box in a small town 2 hours away. The obituary did not mention me. Not once. There was no surviving wife. There was no Naomi. There was no 11-year marriage. According to the obituary, Daniel Whitcomb had died as an unmarried man, with no immediate family, except a sister he had not, in fact, ever had. I looked at the obituary for a long time. Then I picked up my phone. I did not call the police. Not yet. I called my cousin, a woman named Edith, who had worked for the FBI for 22 years, and who had retired the previous spring to a small house in the mountains where she raised chickens and read mystery novels and waited. I had always suspected, for the kind of phone call she was about to receive from me. Edith answered on the third ring. I told her everything. I told her about Marcus. I told her about the funeral. I told her about Helena. I told her about the bank deposits and the obituary and the brass key. I told her, when she asked, that I had not yet confronted Daniel, that I had not yet called the police, that I had not yet done anything except sit at my kitchen table and try to think. Edith was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, Naomi, listen to me carefully. Do not confront him tonight. Do not let him know that you know anything. When he comes home at 9, you are going to greet him the way you have greeted him every night for the past 4 months. You are going to ask him about his day. You are going to make him dinner if he is hungry. You are going to go to bed beside him. And tomorrow morning, after he leaves for whatever it is he is doing all day, you and I are going to sit down together and figure out exactly what your husband has built around you. Do you understand? I understood. Daniel came home at 9:17 that night. He kissed me on the forehead. He said the day had been long. He asked what I had done with my afternoon. I told him I had gone to the coffee shop and read for a while. He smiled. He said that sounded lovely. He went to the bedroom to change out of his work clothes. I stood in the kitchen with my hands flat against the counter, and I made myself breathe, and I made myself smile when he came back into the room, and I made myself, for one more night, be the woman he believed he was married to. He went to sleep at 11. I lay beside him in the dark. I did not sleep. I listened to him breathe, and I thought about the brass key in my pocket. Edith arrived the next morning at 10, an hour after Daniel had left for work. She brought a laptop, a notebook, and the kind of focused calm that comes from a career spent doing exactly this kind of work. We sat at the kitchen table. We opened every file in the office. We pulled every record from the bank. We traced the deposits backward through the routing system. The deposits, Edith determined within 4 hours, were not coming from Harrogate Industries. They were being routed through a shell company that had been set up in Daniel's name 18 months earlier. A company called Whitcomb Logistics Consulting, which had no employees, no clients, no visible business activity, and which existed only to receive and disperse funds. The funds it was dispersing into our joint account were not, as far as Edith could tell, the proceeds of any legitimate business. They were transfers from a second account, also in Daniel's name, that contained a balance of approximately $400,000. The brass key, which we tested at 3 different banks that afternoon, opened a safe deposit box at the second of the 3. The contents of the box were as follows: a passport in the name of Daniel Whitcomb, but with a different photograph and a different date of birth, a driver's license in the same false identity, 2 credit cards in that name, a handwritten ledger that documented, in Daniel's familiar handwriting, a series of transactions over the past 3 years that involved sums of money I did not understand, a second key, smaller than the first, and a single sealed envelope, addressed in Daniel's handwriting, with one word written on the front: Naomi. I opened the envelope in front of Edith. The letter inside was 3 pages long. It was dated 4 months earlier. It began, "If you are reading this, it means something has gone wrong, and I am sorry. I will not tell you everything the letter said, because some things in a marriage belong only to the marriage, even after the marriage has ended. But I will tell you the parts that matter. Daniel had been embezzling from Harrogate Industries for almost 3 years. The amounts had been small at first, the kind of small that no one notices, but they had grown over time, and by the spring of the year of his promotion, he had taken almost $600,000. The promotion, the salary increase, the longer hours, all of it had been a story he had constructed to explain to me where the money was coming from. He had known by April that the company's auditors were going to find the discrepancy within months. He had begun to plan his exit. The plan, as the letter described it, was elaborate. He would, on a date he had selected, fake his own death. He had paid a woman whose name he did not give in the letter, to play the role of his sister Helena. He had constructed an entire false identity. He had purchased the post office box. He had drafted the obituary, He had arranged the funeral. He had intended, after the funeral, to disappear with the money he had taken, and to live, somewhere far away, under the new identity in the safe deposit box. The reason he had not yet disappeared, the reason he had continued to come home to me every night for 4 months after his own funeral, was the part of the letter that broke me. He had not been able to leave. He had stood in the airport on the morning of June 19th with his ticket in his hand, and he had not been able to get on the plane. He had come home instead. He had told me he had a long day ahead of him. He had been, for the past 4 months, a dead man going through the motions of a life he no longer had any legal claim to, returning every night to a wife he had been preparing to abandon because he could not bring himself to make the final break. The letter ended with an apology. It said he was sorry. It said he had loved me. It said he had not known how to tell me what he had done, and that the longer he had failed to tell me, the more impossible the telling had become. It said that if I was reading the letter, the version of him who had loved me was already gone, and that he hoped, someday, I would forgive him for the man he had become in order to deserve the version of him I had married. I read the letter twice. I folded it. I put it back in the envelope. I looked at Edith. She was watching me with the careful, professional expression of a woman who had been preparing, for the past several hours, for exactly this moment. I said, "Edith, I would like to call the police now." She nodded. She picked up her phone. She made the call. The arrest happened the following Tuesday, at 6:45 in the morning, as Daniel was leaving the house for what he believed was another ordinary day at the office that no longer existed. 2 officers were waiting at the curb. He saw them. He stopped on the front walk. He did not run. He turned around, and he looked at the house, and he looked at the front window where I was standing with my coffee, and his face did something I had never seen it do in 11 years of marriage. It collapsed. He understood in that moment that the long lie was over. The trial took 14 months. The charges included embezzlement, fraud, identity theft, and several lesser counts that I do not need to describe. He pleaded guilty to all of them. He was sentenced to 11 years, the same number of years we had been married, which I noted at the sentencing hearing without saying anything aloud. The woman who had played Helena was identified eventually as a former actress named Bridget Calloway, who took a plea deal in exchange for testimony. She was sentenced to 4 years. The money he had embezzled was largely recovered. The money in the safe deposit box was returned to Harrogate Industries. The house, which had been in my name from the beginning, remained mine. I divorced him while he was in prison. The papers were processed quickly. He did not contest anything. I have not spoken to him in 3 years. I am writing this story down because someone asked me, recently, what I had learned. I thought about it for a long time. Here is what I came to. I learned that the most dangerous lies are not the loud ones. The most dangerous lies are the quiet ones, the ones that wear the face of an ordinary morning, the ones that kiss you on the forehead and tell you to have a good day. I learned that a person can sit across from you at a dinner table for 10 years and become, by small degrees, a stranger you no longer recognize, and that the recognition, when it finally comes, will not come from you. It will come from a man in a gray overcoat in a coffee shop who is so sorry for your loss. I learned that the people who love you most are sometimes the people who are most capable of building, around you, a world that is not real, and that the price of being loved by such a person is the slow, invisible erosion of your ability to see what is actually in front of you. And I learned that, when the world finally collapses, the woman who is left standing in the wreckage is not the woman you were before. She is someone new, someone harder, someone who has learned, in the worst possible way, that the only person you can ever truly trust to tell you the truth about your life is the woman in your own mirror. Trust her. Listen to her. And the next time someone you love begins to tell you a story that does not quite make sense, do not let it pass. Do not let yourself believe it just because believing it is easier. Look closer. Ask the next question. Open the drawer. Find the key, because the truth is always there, somewhere, waiting for you to find it. And the longer you wait, the heavier it becomes when you finally do.